There is a version of your story that other people wrote for you a long time ago, and it goes something like this. You are too much, or too quiet, or too intense, or too slow to commit, or too strange to fully belong anywhere. Somebody handed you that label early, a parent, a teacher, a friend who meant well. And some part of you has been quietly carrying it ever since, treating it as a diagnosis rather than what it actually is, a misreading. You have probably spent years wondering why gatherings drain you the way they do. Why the easy answer never quite satisfies you. Why other people seem to move through decisions and relationships and small talk with an ease you have simply never been able to access, no matter how hard you tried to imitate it. Psychology has a very different explanation for almost everything that got labeled abnormal about you, and once you hear it, you will probably never accept the old label again. Stick around for this whole video, because every single one of these mislabeled traits gets rewritten today, and by the end you might finally understand why fitting in never quite worked for you. Start with the label that hurts the most, the idea that you are somehow antisocial, cold, or hard to reach. It usually gets attached to the same evidence every time. You leave gatherings early. You need long stretches alone to feel like yourself again. And you can sit in a room full of people you genuinely love and still feel a quiet urgency to go home. None of that is about disliking people. What actually happens is that your brain treats every conversation as active computation rather than passive listening, tracking tone, reading microexpressions, cross-referencing what someone says against everything you already know about them, all at once, all the time. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying the states in which the mind performs at its absolute best, and found that deep restorative focus almost always requires periods of low external stimulation, precisely the kind of quiet that a packed room can never provide. Solitude, for a mind like yours, is not withdrawal, it is maintenance. And there is a second version of this same mislabel, the discomfort with small talk, which gets called awkward or standoffish, when it is really something closer to the opposite. You are not bad at surface conversation because you lack social skill. You are bad at it because part of you keeps waiting for the exchange to become real, and most exchanges never do. The second label worth dismantling is overthinking, usually delivered as a gentle insult. You analyze everything, just let it go. What actually happens underneath that behavior is what researchers John Cacioppo and Richard Petty named need for cognition, a measurable trait describing how much a person is intrinsically motivated to engage in effortful thinking rather than accept the first available answer. People high on that scale are not more anxious. Studies using this measure consistently found they were more accurate, more comfortable holding complexity, and less likely to collapse a nuanced situation into an oversimplified verdict just to make it stop feeling uncertain. The label overthinking assumes the extra questions are a malfunction. In reality, every question you refuse to skip is doing quiet, invisible work, catching an inconsistency, noticing an angle nobody else considered, arriving somewhere the fast answer never would have reached. Send this to the one person in your life who has been called too intense for as long as you have known them, because the next part explains exactly what that intensity has actually been protecting. The third label is the cruelest one, because it usually comes from someone whose opinion mattered, unmotivated, lazy, full of potential you refuse to use. Underneath that judgment is a mechanism psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan spent decades documenting through what they called self-determination theory, the finding that people driven by genuinely internal values respond far less to external pressure, rewards, deadlines, and social expectation than the average person does. You cannot be bribed into caring about something that does not matter to you, and no amount of guilt changes that either. What looks like a lack of drive from the outside is often a highly selective filter running underneath conscious awareness, quietly asking whether an effort is actually aligned with what you value before committing a single ounce of energy to it. Most environments, schools, offices, families, are built for people who respond automatically to outside pressure. When you do not respond that way, the system calls it a flaw. The truth is closer to the opposite. The system mistook your standards for a ceiling when they were never anything but a filter. The fourth label is the strangest one to carry, because it usually shows up as a compliment wrapped around a wound. You always know exactly what people are really feeling, like it is a party trick instead of a quiet weight you carry through every room you enter. You clock the tension behind a forced laugh, the gap between someone's words and their energy, the story someone is telling you that does not match the story their body is telling you at the same time. The psychologist Daniel Goleman, whose research helped popularize the concept of emotional intelligence, described this capacity as a specific combination of accurate emotional perception and rapid, largely unconscious processing of nonverbal signals, tone, posture, timing, all absorbed and interpreted before the conscious mind even catches up. The gift is real, and so is the isolation that comes with it. because once you can see beneath someone's surface, you cannot choose to stop seeing it. And you end up carrying information about people that they never consciously gave you, wondering why real closeness feels so rare when you're the one who keeps noticing everything first. What makes this particular label so exhausting is that it rarely comes with an off switch. You cannot decide, walking into a birthday party or a work event, to simply stop reading the room for one evening. The perception runs whether you invite it or not, which is exactly why so many people carrying this trait describe feeling closer to strangers within minutes than to people they have technically known for years. Because closeness, for you, was never about the length of the relationship. It was always about how much of the performance the other person was willing to drop. The fifth label is coldness, usually pointed at you during a crisis, when everyone else is visibly falling apart and you go quiet instead. That stillness gets read as detachment, as not caring enough to react. What it actually is has a name in the research on emotional regulation: distress tolerance, the capacity to sit inside intense emotion without being controlled by it. Most people build that capacity deliberately, through years of therapy, breath work, or hard practice. For you, it has often been the automatic setting for as long as you can remember, which means people rarely see the years of internal work that built it. They only see the calm on the surface and mistake it for absence of feeling. You feel plenty. You simply learned, somewhere along the way, how to hold feeling without letting it run the room. A sixth label attaches itself to how you use silence, and it makes people around you strangely uncomfortable in a way they usually cannot articulate. You can spend an entire evening without music, without a screen, without anything filling the space, and feel completely at ease rather than restless. The psychiatrist Anthony Storr spent much of his career studying the relationship between solitude and creative or psychological development, and found that the capacity to be alone without needing constant external stimulation was consistently associated with deeper self-understanding, not with loneliness or social failure the way popular assumptions suggested. What unsettles other people about your silence is rarely the silence itself, it is what it implies. That you have already spent real time with your own mind and made peace with what lives there, while filling every quiet moment with noise is often how people avoid doing exactly that. A seventh label gets pointed at the part of you that seems to think 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, weighing consequences before a decision even gets made. And it usually gets called overly cautious or a worrier. The psychologist Martin Seligman, later in his career, turned his research toward what he called prospection, the mind's capacity to mentally simulate future outcomes before they happen, and argued that this forward-looking simulation, not memory of the past, is actually the primary engine behind human decision-making and planning. Your habit of asking what happens next, and then what happens after that, is not anxiety dressed up as intelligence. It is that exact mechanism running at a higher resolution than most people ever notice in themselves, quietly preventing mistakes that never become visible precisely because they never happened. There is one more misreading worth naming before we move forward, and it lives in how you handle your own opinions. Most people quietly protect what they already believe, because changing a stated position feels like admitting they were wrong, and the mind treats that as a threat to identity rather than an update to information. The social psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated just how strong that pull toward agreement can be. In experiments where ordinary participants gave answers they knew were incorrect, simply because everyone around them had given the same wrong answer first. The desire to belong quietly overpowered the desire to be accurate. You experience something closer to the opposite reaction. When solid evidence appears against something you believed, it does not land as an attack, it lands as progress, because your sense of self was never fully fused to any single opinion you happened to hold at one point in time. That is not indecision. It is a rare form of intellectual security, the kind that lets you say "I had not considered that" without feeling like the ground moved under you. A closely related label gets aimed at you whenever you seem older than the room you are standing in, not superior, just somewhere else entirely, quietly unmoved by whatever urgent drama has everyone else's full attention. Family may have called it too serious for your age. Friends may have called it distant. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl spent his career studying how people orient themselves around meaning rather than pleasure or status, and one of the clearest findings to come out of that tradition is that some people begin asking meaning-focused questions. What matters? What lasts? What any of this is actually for? Years before their peers start asking them at all. That early orientation does not make you cold toward smaller concerns. It just means those concerns rarely feel as urgent to you as they do to everyone else in the room. And the resulting gap gets misread as arrogance when it was never anything but a different timeline. A second related label attaches to how you handle not knowing something, and it usually gets called indecisive or unfocused, jumping from one subject to another instead of settling on a single lane the way everyone expects. The psychologist Ellen Langer built an entire body of research around what she called conditional thinking, showing that minds trained to sit comfortably with maybe, rather than rushing toward a premature certainty, consistently produced more creative and more accurate solutions over time. Your restlessness across subjects is not a failure to commit. It is closer to the opposite. An unwillingness to accept a tidy answer before the actual complexity of a question has been genuinely explored, even when that means living inside uncertainty far longer than other people find comfortable. An eighth label shows up in the small, everyday moments almost nobody else notices. Agreeing with an opinion you privately question, laughing at a joke that did not land, saying yes when the honest answer was no. For most people, these moments cost nothing. For you, they accumulate into something closer to real discomfort. The researcher Brené Brown spent years studying vulnerability and authenticity, and found that people who consistently prioritize staying true to their actual values over securing approval report significantly higher well-being over time, even though that choice frequently costs them acceptance in the short term. What gets labeled as difficult or too particular is often just an inability to tolerate the small, accumulating friction of pretending, long after most people have simply stopped noticing they are doing it at all. Comment the number of the label that has followed you the longest. One word or one number is enough, because plenty of people scrolling through these comments are about to realize they are not the only one carrying it. One final label deserves its own moment, because it rarely gets named directly, even though almost everyone who carries these traits has felt it. It shows up as a quiet detachment from the entire game of comparison, not caring who earns more, who looks happier online, who is further ahead by whatever metric the room has agreed to measure that week. People sometimes read that detachment as arrogance, as though refusing to compete means believing you have already won. The psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades studying what separates people who keep growing across a lifetime from people who plateau early. And one of the clearest patterns to emerge from that research is that the most durable form of motivation compares today's version of yourself against yesterday's, not against a stranger's curated highlight reel. Stepping out of the comparison game is not superiority. It is simply the discovery that the only scoreboard actually worth watching was the one measuring your own growth the whole time. Someone watching this is probably thinking that this description could apply to almost anyone if it is worded generously enough, and that is a fair thing to question. Horoscope-style flattery works precisely because vague, positive statements feel personally true to nearly everyone who reads them. The difference here is specificity and cost. A vague compliment makes you feel good and asks nothing of you. What we just walked through is a cluster of documented traits that come bundled with a real measurable price, exhaustion after socializing, that healthy extroverts do not experience the same way. Friction with authority figures who expect automatic compliance. Difficulty finding conversations that do not feel hollow. A nagging awareness of the gap between what you are capable of and what your circumstances have allowed you to express. If none of that resonates, this video simply was not describing you, and that is completely fine. But if most of it landed with an uncomfortable kind of accuracy, that accuracy is the signal, not the flattery. Notice too that none of these 8 labels required you to be gifted in some narrow academic sense, and none of them required a diagnosis of any kind. They are simply describing a specific way of processing the world, one that shows up across very different kinds of people, in very different kinds of lives, all sharing the same underlying pattern of depth where the world expected speed. None of this means you are better than anyone else, and it definitely does not mean you should treat every disagreement as proof that other people simply cannot keep up. It means the traits that got mislabeled early were never a defect to manage down to something smaller and easier to carry around. They were and still are a specific and coherent way of processing a world that mostly rewards the opposite approach. Fast answers over deep ones, constant availability over restorative solitude, agreement over accuracy, performance over presence. Understanding that does not erase the loneliness that sometimes comes with thinking this way. But it does change what that loneliness means. It stops being evidence that something is wrong with you. It becomes the ordinary cost of a mind that was built to go deeper than the room usually asks for. There is a simple way to tell whether you are actually carrying these traits or just enjoying a flattering description of yourself. And it has nothing to do with how the words made you feel. It has to do with whether the traits show up when nobody is watching and nothing is being gained from performing them. Do you still ask the extra question when the easy answer would end the conversation faster, and nobody would notice the difference? Do you still walk away from an opportunity that pays well but conflicts with something you actually value, even when accepting it would be the easier story to tell people at dinner? Do you still sit with your own thoughts in a quiet room instead of reaching for a screen, even when nobody would ever know either way? Those private, unwitnessed choices are where the traits either prove themselves real or reveal themselves as a flattering costume you tried on for the length of one video. If you recognized yourself in even half of what we covered today, chances are you already knew the answer before you finished reading this sentence. If you want a simple way to check whether any of this actually applies to you, notice what happens the next time someone tries to hand you one of these old labels. Lazy, too much, too sensitive, too intense, too quiet. Notice whether the label feels like it is describing something broken, or whether, somewhere underneath the sting, it is actually describing something precise, something that was working correctly the entire time, just never explained to you in language that made sense until now. The old label was never wrong about what people were observing. It was wrong about what that observation meant, and that single correction is enough to change how you carry every one of these traits from here forward. Tell us in the comments which label you are finally ready to let go of. Subscribe if this is the kind of psychology that actually explains your own mind instead of talking around it. Send this to the person you know who has spent years apologizing for being exactly like this, and leave a like before you go.